The Harrington Grand Estate sat on 40 acres of manicured Connecticut landscape. The kind of property that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. Ivory stone pillars framed the entrance. Live string quartets played beneath pergolas draped in white wisteria. Bentleys and Escalades lined the stone-paved drive in patient rows, their chrome catching the late afternoon sun like an exhibit of controlled excess. Inside the grand hall, crystal chandeliers the size of small boats hung from vaulted ceilings, each one throwing 1,000 shards of warm gold light across the assembled faces of senators, venture capitalists, foreign dignitaries, and the kind of billionaires who wore quiet watches and said very little. The air smelled of gardenias and French champagne, and beneath it all, something sharper, the faint electrical charge of power collected in one room. Vanessa Carter stood at the center of it, and she was magnificent. At 34, she moved through wealth the way she'd once moved through ambition, with total fluency, as if she'd been born into it rather than clawed her way toward it over 15 years of pre-dawn meetings, canceled vacations, and decisions that would have broken most people before breakfast. She had built Meridian Analytics from a 3-person startup operating out of a subleased office in Newark into a $2 billion data firm that governments and Fortune 100 companies paid enormous retainers to keep on call. Forbes had profiled her twice. Her name appeared on advisory panels and keynote rosters. She collected accolades the way other women collected shoes. Today, she wore a gown designed by a French house whose waiting list ran 2 years. Ivory silk that pooled at her feet and caught the chandelier light in a way that made her look assembled from the room itself. Her dark hair was swept up and pinned with a constellation of small diamonds. Her makeup was flawless. She had rehearsed this day in her mind since she was 19 years old. And every element, the floral arrangements imported from the Netherlands, the custom stationery, the 8-tier cake from the only patisserie in Manhattan she trusted, was exactly as she had designed it. Her fiancé, Bradford Ellison III, was everything a wedding of this scale required. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying the easy confidence of third-generation money and a Yale education. He shook hands with the room's heavyweights and made each of them feel, briefly, like they were the most important person present. His father, Douglas Ellison, who controlled the largest private equity group in New England, had welcomed Vanessa into the family with a handshake that meant more than most people's signatures. His mother, Patricia, wore pearls that had belonged to 3 generations of Ellison women and had said, at their first dinner together, "Vanessa, you are exactly what this family has been waiting for." Vanessa had framed that sentence somewhere in the architecture of her ambition and carried it ever since. Her wedding coordinator, a brisk woman named Claudette who communicated largely through earpiece and clipboard, materialized at her elbow during the pre-ceremony reception. "Everything is on schedule. The senator from Connecticut just arrived. The ambassador is requesting a photo." And she hesitated in the almost imperceptible way that trained professionals hesitate when they're deciding how to deliver bad news. "Your father is here." Vanessa's expression didn't change. That was one of her skills, the absolute management of her face in moments that wanted to crack it open. "Where is he?" "Near the east gate. He came alone. He's..." Another pause. "He's not dressed for the guest list." She already knew what that meant. She had sent her father an invitation because not sending one would have looked strange to the few people who knew she had a father at all. She had assumed, had hoped, that Richard Carter would understand, without being told directly, that the invitation was a formality. That this world was not his world, that his presence at this particular gathering, among these particular people, would create a problem she did not have the emotional bandwidth to manage on the most important day of her professional and personal life. He had not understood. "Keep him comfortable," Vanessa said, her voice carrying all the warmth of a legal brief. "Give him something to eat. Keep him away from the main hall and the terrace. Do not let him near the Ellisons." Claudette nodded precisely and disappeared. Outside the east gate, Richard Carter stood on the gravel path with his hands folded in front of him, holding a gift wrapped in blue paper and tied with a white ribbon his neighbor Margaret had helped him with, because his fingers weren't what they used to be. He was 61 years old. He was wearing the dark suit he'd bought 4 years ago for his neighbor's funeral, the only formal suit he owned, and it fit him the way borrowed clothing fits a man who spends his time in work shirts and jeans. His shoes were polished. He had polished them himself that morning, sitting at the kitchen table at 5:30, the way he used to shine his boots before inspection. He looked at the estate, at the lights moving behind the tall windows, at the silhouettes of people assembled in grandeur, and he smiled to himself the way a man smiles when he sees something that makes him quietly proud, even though it has moved beyond him. His daughter had built all of this. He didn't understand most of what she did, but he understood that she'd built it. That was enough. More than enough. A young man in a catering uniform appeared and offered him a glass of water and pointed him toward a stone bench near the garden wall, just outside the glow of the main reception. Richard thanked him, sat down, and balanced the blue-wrapped gift on his knees, and waited with the patience of a man who had spent years in positions that required stillness. Inside, Vanessa smiled at the ambassador, posed for photographs with Bradford, and told herself she had made the only reasonable decision. Some contexts simply could not accommodate every element of a person's history. This was not cruelty. This was management. She almost believed it. An hour into the reception, one of Bradford's cousins, a loose-limbed young man named Trevor who had consumed 3 glasses of champagne before the ceremony and was working on his 4th, wandered toward the east garden and came back with a question. "There's an older man sitting outside near the hedges," Trevor said, loudly enough that the small cluster of guests around him could hear, wearing a kind of rumpled suit. "Is he one of the groundskeepers, or—" Vanessa was across the room when this happened, but close enough to hear. She crossed the distance in 12 steps, took Trevor gently by the arm, and redirected the conversation with a smile that could have been filed under courtesy in a dictionary. "He's an old acquaintance of the family," she said. "He prefers the garden. You know how some people are." Trevor shrugged and moved toward the cheese display, but the damage was ambient. 2 of the Ellison cousins' women who navigated social rooms with the precision of air traffic controllers had heard. They exchanged a glance of the specific, compressed variety that carries more information than a paragraph. One of them, a sharp-faced woman named Genevieve, said to the other behind a raised champagne flute, "She really doesn't want anyone to know, does she?" It wasn't a question. At 5:30, Richard decided he would try to find Vanessa, not to intrude, just to see her for a moment, to hand her the gift, to tell her she looked beautiful. He had driven 3 hours on Greyhound to be here. He had asked his neighbor Margaret to write the card because his handwriting had gotten difficult. The gift inside the blue paper was a framed photograph, the 2 of them at Vanessa's college graduation, 18 years ago. Her in the purple regalia, and him in the same kind of slightly wrong suit, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said. He had kept that photograph on his mantelpiece for all 18 years. He thought she might want it now, starting a new chapter. He found a side door and followed the sound of voices into the edge of the main hall's antechamber, where the light and warmth of the reception spilled outward. He stood there for a moment, framed in the doorway, looking in. He didn't see Vanessa see him, but she did. She appeared at his side within 30 seconds. She took him by the elbow and guided him, with the firm gentleness of someone managing a situation, back toward the door. "Dad." Her voice was low and horizontal. "You can't be in here." He looked at her, the gown, the diamonds, the composure. "I just wanted to say hello, sweetheart." "You look, not now." She released his elbow and glanced back into the room, checking. "I have 500 guests in there, including 2 sitting senators and the Ellison family. I need tonight to be—" She stopped, collected herself. "I can't have distractions right now." Richard looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not wounded in any sharp way. It was something quieter than that, and therefore harder to witness. "I'm not trying to distract you," he said. "I know. But I just wanted to see you, Dad." She said his name the way people say a word when they want it to be a door closing. "Please. Claudette will take care of you. There's food outside. Stay where you are, and I'll come find you when I have a moment." She walked back into the light, without waiting for his answer. Richard stood in the doorway for a few seconds, then turned and walked back to his bench. He set the blue gift on the ground beside his feet and looked out at the garden and the darkening sky, where the first suggestion of rain was building at the edges of the clouds. He was not angry. Anger was an emotion that required a certain expectation, and Richard Carter had learned, over the past several years, to hold his expectations of his daughter loosely. She was busy. She was building something. She had always been building something. He thought about the night she'd called him, years ago, to tell him she'd gotten her first major contract, her voice electric with a joy she'd forgotten to perform. She'd called him first, before her business partners, before her investors. Him first. He held on to that. The rain arrived gently at first, misting across the garden in thin veils. Richard did not move to find shelter. He just sat, in his borrowed ceremony suit, on a stone bench outside the wedding of his daughter, and let the rain come. There is a particular geometry to sacrifice. It is almost always invisible from the front. The person receiving it sees the effect the school uniform laid out, the rent paid, the meal on the table, but not the arithmetic behind it. All the invisible subtractions that made each thing possible. Richard Carter had been doing that arithmetic for 30 years. Eleanor, his wife, had died of ovarian cancer when Vanessa was 4. He remembered the morning with a clarity that had never softened. The hospital corridor, the attending physician's face, the way the fluorescent light seemed to harden into something structural. He'd driven home and sat in his car in the driveway for 45 minutes before going inside, where his daughter was asleep on the couch in the care of Eleanor's sister, one small arm thrown over a stuffed rabbit she'd named Professor. He'd had a career in the army then. He'd been 31. His commanding officer had told him with genuine conviction, a future that could go as far as he wanted to take it. What he'd had was a 4-year-old daughter who had just lost her mother, and he'd determined, with the same clarity that governed tactical decisions, that the two things could not coexist. A military career of the kind he'd been building required absence deployment, rotation, the sustained surrendering of home to mission. His daughter needed the one thing that couldn't be delegated or scheduled: presence. He'd submitted his separation papers 3 months after Eleanor died. His commanding officer, a man named General Marcus Webb, had tried to talk him out of it. Had told him there were options, support structures, ways to make it work. Richard had listened carefully and then declined. With a respect that was not dismissal, he simply understood, with terrible precision, what mattered most. He'd come home to New Jersey and taken a job at a machine shop, then a second job on weekends doing property maintenance, then a third. Briefly, driving a delivery van until his knee, the one that had been rebuilt after a mission he never described in detail, began to deteriorate again. He'd cooked dinner every night that he was physically able. He'd attended every school event. He'd read aloud every night from whatever book Vanessa was working through, sitting on the edge of her bed in his work clothes, his voice adapting its register to the story's demands, making wolves sound afraid and princesses sound brave. He had sold his father's watch, the only valuable object he'd inherited, to cover the deposit on Vanessa's freshman dormitory. He had applied, through a veterans network he'd never mentioned to Vanessa, for a supplemental scholarship that had helped cover her junior year. He'd asked the man who processed the application to keep it confidential, and apparently the man had honored that, because Vanessa had graduated believing she'd won the scholarship purely on merit. Richard had never corrected that belief. Her confidence in herself was too important to complicate. The machine shop had closed when Vanessa was in her senior year of college. He'd found warehouse work. Then, when his knee became non-negotiable about its limitations, desk work, data entry for a logistics company, night shifts, the kind of employment that exists at the edge of the visible economy. He hadn't told Vanessa about the knee surgeries. Each time there'd been a procedure, he'd timed it during a week. She was especially busy, so the gaps in communication seemed natural. He had watched her build Meridian Analytics from a distance, through quarterly phone calls and occasional dinners that had grown, over the years, both shorter and less frequent. He'd watched her change. He'd understood it intellectually, the pressures of a world he had no direct access to, the social calibrations required to move at her level, the way identity reshapes itself around the rooms it most wants to belong to. He'd understood it the way a man can understand something that hurts him anyway. He'd never told her any of this. Not because he wanted credit, he'd made his choices freely, and he'd made them with his eyes open, but because he'd believed, and continued to believe, that love was not a ledger. That recording what you'd given was a way of making a gift into a debt. So he'd said nothing, and watched, and kept the graduation photograph on his mantelpiece, and waited for the version of his daughter, who called him first, to come back around. The rain was falling steadily now, tapping against his suit jacket, darkening the shoulders. He looked at the blue-wrapped gift on the ground and thought about the photograph inside it, thought about her face in it, the pure, unguarded laughter, the purple regalia, the way she'd grabbed his arm and squeezed it without thinking. He thought about the distance between that moment and this one, and he decided, with the practiced equanimity of a man who had absorbed a great deal of loss, that he would leave the gift at the door and find his way back to the bus station. He reached for the package. That was the moment the sirens began. 20 minutes before Richard reached for his package, Vanessa had taken the microphone. The main hall had settled into that particular attention that descends when a room full of important people has decided to listen. Bradford stood beside her, his hand at her back. The chandeliers blazed. 500 faces turned upward. Vanessa spoke the way she did everything, with precision and control. Each sentence placed like a building block in an architecture she had designed in advance. She thanked the venue, the vendors, the wedding party. She thanked her investors, her mentors, her board members, several of whom were seated in the front rows. She thanked the Ellison family, Douglas and Patricia, who had welcomed her into their home and their legacy, and her voice carried a warmth in that passage that was genuine, because she had earned her place beside these people, and she was grateful for what that meant. She thanked Bradford, and that was the one moment she allowed something unscripted to surface, a brief unsteadiness in her composure that read, "To everyone watching, as love." Somewhere in the prepared text, there was a space she had left deliberately empty. A man near the back, silver-haired, the type who asked inconvenient questions at board meetings, raised his voice during the first pause. "What about family? Any family you'd like to recognize?" The room waited. Vanessa's smile did not flicker. "My foundation has been my work and the people in it," she said. "The family I've chosen, from 3 tables over." Genevieve leaned toward her companion and said, very quietly, "She has a father outside in the rain." Her companion said nothing. At the East Garden, Richard stood up and picked up the blue package and took one step toward the side door, his plan, forming, quiet and dignified. Leave the gift. Walk to the road. Call a car when the first sound reached him, not the speech. He hadn't heard the speech from where he sat. What he heard was the low, layered sound of military convoy engines with a particular cadence, the organized weight of multiple vehicles moving in coordinated formation. He knew that sound the way musicians know a key change. He stopped walking. Inside the hall, the string quartet had gone silent. Claudette was speaking urgently into her earpiece. Bradford's head turned toward the tall windows facing the drive, where headlights were moving through the dark in a way that didn't resemble wedding guests arriving late. A security officer stepped to the microphone, spoke 2 words to Claudette, and Claudette went rigid in a way that suggested the 2 words were significant. 3 black SUVs and a staff car moved in practiced formation up the gravel drive. They stopped with the precision of rehearsed placement. A door opened. General Marcus Webb stepped out. He was 72 years old, and carried his years with the specific authority of a man who had decided, early in life, that gravity was a force to be negotiated rather than surrendered to. His uniform was immaculate, 4 stars on each shoulder, ribbons across his chest representing a career of consequence. Behind him, 6 other uniformed officers stepped out and fell into position without being told. The hall had gone completely silent. Webb's aide spoke to the estate's head of security, who walked directly to Vanessa with the expression of a man carrying a message he doesn't fully understand but knows is important. "General Webb is asking for Richard Carter," he said. The name landed in the room like a stone, into still water. Bradford turned to look at Vanessa. She was already looking at the window. General Webb walked into the main hall and stopped. 500 people looked at him. He looked back at them with the equanimity of a man accustomed to rooms that rearranged themselves at his arrival. Then he addressed the room directly, in a voice calibrated for parade grounds and did not require a microphone. "I'm looking for Sergeant Richard Carter. I was told he's here." The silence in the hall was the specific silence of collective bewilderment, not rudeness, but the genuine, suspended breath quality of 500 people simultaneously recalibrating. Vanessa stepped forward. Her face was a controlled surface, but beneath it, something was shifting, the first tremor in architecture that has been carrying too much load. "General Webb," she said, and her voice was steady. "I'm Vanessa Carter, Richard's daughter." Webb looked at her with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who sees people clearly. "Then you know where he is. He's outside." "In the garden." Webb nodded once and turned back toward the entrance. The 6 officers fell into step behind him. Vanessa followed, and behind her, in a slow tide of bewildered fascination, came a significant portion of the wedding's most important guests. The East Garden. Richard saw the group emerge from the estate's side door and processed the situation with the same rapid assessment he'd trained into himself years ago. He recognized the uniform first, then the posture, then the face. "Marcus," he said quietly. "Not General. Marcus." Webb crossed the garden toward him, and there was something in the general's stride, a directional certainty, a purpose that made several of the guests stop and understand they were about to witness something they hadn't planned to see. Webb stopped 3 feet from Richard and looked at him, the wet suit, the bench, the blue-wrapped package on the ground, and something moved through the general's face that was not sentimentality exactly. It was older than that. It was recognition. He came to attention. Full, formal, military attention, the spine straight, the chin level, the eyes forward, the right hand rising to his brow in the precise geometry of a salute rendered to a superior, or to a flag, or to something held in the deepest category of honor. 6 officers came to attention behind him and saluted in unison. The garden was silent, except for the rain and the distant sound of the string quartet that had started again inside, not knowing yet that the most important music tonight was happening outdoors. Richard did not move for a moment. Then, with the deliberate slowness of a man who had packed away certain identities, and was now, unexpectedly, being asked to acknowledge them, he straightened. His knee hurt. It always hurt. He straightened anyway. "General," he said. Webb held the salute. Behind Vanessa, Bradford Ellison quietly reached out and touched her arm, not as a comfort but as a steadying gesture the kind offered when someone might need to be held up. Vanessa was looking at her father standing in the rain, being saluted by one of the most decorated generals in the United States Army, and the architecture inside her was doing something it had not done in a very long time. It was cracking. Webb lowered his hand. He spoke to the assembled guests because they were there, because they deserved to understand what they were looking at with the directness of a man who does not believe in leaving things ambiguous when they deserve to be clear. 30 years ago, Webb said, I was a major leading a 4-man reconnaissance unit in a situation that had gone wrong in several directions simultaneously. We were cut off from support, 1 man down, taking fire from 2 positions. He paused, not for effect, because the memory was still load-bearing. Sergeant Richard Carter was assigned to a different unit operating in a parallel theater. His unit had completed their objective. By every standard of protocol and self-preservation, his job was done. He looked at Richard. He heard our radio contact cut out. He came back. The rain had paused, one of those brief discontinuities in a storm, as if the weather had decided to listen. He came back, and he extracted 3 of my men from a position that no one with a working instinct for self-preservation should have entered. He took fire. He kept moving. When the 4th man, me, was pinned behind a vehicle with a fragment wound that was becoming its own kind of problem, Sergeant Carter made a decision that his commanding officer would later describe, in the after-action report, as either the bravest or the most insane thing he'd ever documented. Possibly both. A pause. He succeeded. Someone in the group of guests shifted. The sound was very loud. He was offered a commendation. Multiple commendations. Webb's voice modulated, not downward, but inward. He declined them. He said, "And I remember this precisely. I didn't do it for the paper. I did it because they were my people." He submitted his separation request 3 months later. We tried to retain him. He had a future in this institution that would have taken him as far as his considerable abilities would carry him. Webb looked at Vanessa, and his gaze was not unkind. He went home to raise his daughter alone. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any of the evening's previous silences. It was not the silence of people waiting for what came next. It was the silence of people absorbing weight they had not expected to carry. Vanessa's hand was over her mouth. She was looking at her father at the slight irregularity in the way he stood, the left side bearing fractionally more weight than the right, a compensation she had noticed 10,000 times and never once asked about because there had always been another conversation, more pressing, another agenda item, another version of the future to tend to. His knee. The surgeries he'd never mentioned. She thought about a night when she was 9 years old, when she'd come downstairs at 2 in the morning for water, and found her father sitting at the kitchen table with his pant leg rolled up, applying something carefully to a scar that ran from his knee to mid-thigh. A topography she'd glimpsed and never examined. He'd seen her and smiled and pulled the pant leg down and said, "Go back to sleep, kid. Bad dreams?" She'd said no. She'd gone back upstairs. She'd never asked. She was asking now, silently, in the rain, in the garden, at her own wedding, 31 years too late. Webb was not finished. "I have stayed in contact with Richard Carter for 3 decades. Not officially, he wasn't interested in official. Informally. As one man stays in contact with another man, who changed the outcome of his life." He paused. "I have heard, over those years, about his daughter. About Meridian Analytics. About tonight." Something in his voice went very quiet. "I made a decision to be here." After Webb finished speaking, there was a woman. Her name was Dolores Hatch, and she was 70. Richard's neighbor from the years in Trenton, a small woman with white hair and the kind of moral directness that people either find bracing or exhausting. She had not been invited to the wedding. She had come with Webb's convoy because Webb had tracked her down, because she had kept certain letters. She stood forward, holding a folder, and she looked at Vanessa with the expression of a woman who has decided that now is the right time for truth. "I've known your father for 22 years, she said. "I want you to know a few things." She opened the folder. Inside were documents. Pay stubs from a logistics company, going back to 2008 night shift. Minimum wage. Adjacent, 40 hours a week. A receipt from a pawn shop for a Breitling watch sold in 2011. A letter from a veterans financial assistance program, countersigned by Richard, confirming a supplemental scholarship disbursement to the registrar of Vanessa's university, dated the fall of her junior year. "He asked the program coordinator to keep it quiet," Dolores said. "Didn't want you to feel like the scholarship wasn't yours." The last document in the folder was a letter. Not official. Handwritten. On lined paper, dated 3 years ago. Richard had written it to Dolores during a period when his knee had required a second surgery, and he'd needed someone to check his mail. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was just what people write when they need to put something outside themselves. Dolores read one passage aloud. She'd asked Richard, outside, before the general had entered the hall, and he'd said, with characteristic quietness, "If you think it matters," she read, "I don't tell Vanessa about the hard parts because she worries, and worrying takes up space that she needs for building. I would rather she build. That's what I came home from the army for, to make room for her to build. I'm proud of every single thing she's done. I just miss my kids sometimes." Dolores closed the folder. Vanessa had stopped managing her face entirely. She was standing in a garden, in a dress that had cost more than a year of her father's wages, at a wedding attended by senators and billionaires. And she was feeling the specific, structural grief of a person who has discovered, all at once, the full dimensions of what they failed to see. Bradford put his arm around her. She stepped away from it. She needed to feel this, without being cushioned, the scholarship. She had been proud of that scholarship, told the story of winning it at dinners, in interviews, in the architecture of her own mythology. I earned my own way. The pride she'd built on that fact now revealed itself to have been built on something more complicated. Not false, she had worked, genuinely, furiously, but not the whole story either. Her father had been part of the story. Her father had always been part of the story. And she had systematically edited him out, until tonight, when the story had declined to be edited. She looked at the blue package on the ground near the bench. She walked to it and picked it up, and for a moment, she just stood there holding it. "Can I open it?" she asked. And her voice was not the voice she had used all evening. It was the voice of someone younger and less certain. Richard, who had stood through this entire passage with his arms at his sides, and his expression the dignified unreadability of a man who has not given himself permission to want things he doesn't expect to receive, nodded. She tore the paper. The photograph, 18 years old, and both of them laughing at something the photographer had said, the purple regalia, his slightly wrong suit, her arm through his, the evidence of a moment before everything had become what it became. There is a specific cruelty in arriving late to the truth, not because the truth has changed, but because you understand, with retroactive precision, every moment you chose not to look for it. Richard had waited until the general finished speaking, and then he'd done the thing he'd spent 30 years doing. He tried to make himself smaller so someone else could take up more room. He'd begun, quietly, to move toward the estate's perimeter. Not dramatic, not a statement, just a man of 61, in a wet suit, with a bad knee, trying to spare his daughter any further complication on her wedding day. He'd gotten about 20 feet when Vanessa called after him, "Dad." He stopped. She had never used that word in precisely that register, not the childhood word, which was full and warm, and not the adult word, which had gradually become something efficient and brief. This was different. This was the word broken open, all its syllables exposed. He turned. She was walking toward him in the garden, in the rain, in the French-designed gown, and she was not managing anything. Her makeup was not quite destroyed but was heading there. And she was not concerned about it. Behind her, 50 guests had followed without being invited. Because this was the kind of moment that draws people in its gravity. She stopped in front of him. There were things she had prepared to say, Vanessa Carter always prepared, and none of them were adequate, and she knew that, and she said them anyway, because inadequacy was all she had. "I'm sorry," she said. "I told security to keep you away from my wedding. I called you a distraction to your face. I let people laugh at you." Each sentence fell out of her like something she'd been carrying for a long time. "I told a room full of strangers I didn't have family when you were standing outside in the rain." Richard said nothing. "I have been so ashamed," she said, "of where we came from, of your suits and your jobs and the way you talk. And the whole time," she stopped, breathed, "the whole time you were the most, you were just—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Her father looked at her. The rain was in his hair and on his shoulders, and he looked at his daughter the way he had always looked at her, without reserve, without calculation, with the full, uncomplicated weight of a love that had never needed to be performed because it had never been in question. "Vanessa," he said. She shook her head. She was not finished. "I found out tonight that you sold Grandpa's watch. I found out you worked nights for years and didn't tell me. I found out about the scholarship." Her voice fractured along the last word. "You let me think I did it myself." "You did," he said. "Dad, I helped with the paperwork. You did everything else." He said it with the absolute conviction of a man who has spent a long time thinking about the difference between supporting someone and doing the work for them. "Every decision you made, every late night, every pitch, every time you refused to give up. That was you." She looked at him. "I just made sure the ground held," he said. She crossed the remaining distance between them and put her arms around him. And it was the embrace of someone who has traveled a very long way and arrived at last at the right place. He held her, his daughter, in her extraordinary dress, in the rain, at her wedding, and the ground held, as it always had. Behind them, no one spoke. General Webb, standing with his officers on the stone path, had the expression of a man watching the conclusion of a long story. And he was correct. Webb spoke one word to his aide, and the aide crossed to the 6 officers and spoke to them quietly. They straightened, aligned, came to attention as a unit. Webb turned to face Richard and raised his hand for the 2nd time that evening. The salute held. The 6 officers saluted in unison. From somewhere inside the estate, 3 of the military guests who had been attending the wedding as civilian invitees had emerged in the last few minutes and were now standing at the garden's edge in their evening clothes, but straight-backed at something that couldn't quite be called military attention, but was close enough that its meaning was clear. Douglas Ellison, standing near the back of the assembled guests, was looking at Richard Carter with an expression that his family would later describe as the first time they'd ever seen him look genuinely surprised. He turned to Patricia and said something quietly. She nodded. He walked forward. Douglas Ellison was a man who had spent his adult life calibrating exactly whom he was willing to cross a room for. He crossed it now. He extended his hand to Richard. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I apologize that you weren't seated with us this evening." He said it with the directness of a man who was not in the habit of apologizing and understood that the directness was therefore the point. "Please come inside." Richard looked at his hand, then took it. Bradford, who had been watching all of this from a short distance, came forward and addressed his father briefly, then walked to Vanessa and put his hand out not to her arm, but to her father's. "I've just been told," Bradford said quietly, "that we have a reserved seat at the main table that isn't being used. It has been unused all evening. I'd like to correct that, if you're willing." Richard looked at Vanessa. She took his arm. Not his elbow. His arm. The full, uncomplicated claim of it. "Come inside," she said. They walked in together through the side door, across the marble floor of the antechamber, through the tall double doors into the main hall, where the chandeliers blazed, and the guests had returned to their seats, and the quiet had the specific texture of a room that has agreed to receive something. Vanessa led her father to the table at the center of the room, where the place card that had sat blank all evening was beside hers, and she pulled out the chair, and her father sat down, and there was a silence, not stunned, not waiting, but full. The silence of an ending that resolves properly. Then she went to the microphone. She stood there for a moment. The prepared text was gone. She hadn't come to this microphone with notes. "Earlier tonight," she said, "I thanked my mentors and my investors and the family I'd chosen. I talked about the career I'd built." She paused. "I left someone out. I left out the man who made the career possible in the first place. Not by giving me anything I hadn't earned, he was too careful about that. A breath. But by making sure, every single day, for 20 years, that the ground I was building on would hold." She looked at her father, at the center table, in his wet suit that had dried somewhat under the chandelier light, with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes bright. "The greatest man in this room was the one I almost abandoned tonight," she said. "His name is Richard Carter. He is my father. He is a decorated veteran. He is a man of extraordinary courage, who spent his courage quietly, in ways I was too busy to notice." She stopped, let it settle. "I notice now." The room stood. It was not orchestrated. There was no signal given. It simply happened, 500 people rising in the organic, spontaneous way that people rise when they witness something that demands acknowledgement. Richard Carter, seated at the center table at his daughter's wedding, looked at the standing room and did the only thing that felt honest. He looked at his hands, and he let his eyes fill, and he made no attempt to prevent it. He had not cried since Eleanor's funeral. 30 years was a long time. The math of it caught him off guard. After the wedding, after the guests had gone and the chandeliers were dimmed, and the estate staff moved quietly through the aftermath of celebration, Richard Carter rode home in the car that Bradford's family sent without being asked. It was a different kind of transportation than the Greyhound he'd taken in the morning. But he fell asleep in it the same way, quickly, completely, the way men fall asleep who have been expending effort that doesn't show. The blue ribbon from the gift package was in his pocket. Vanessa had given it back to him. The photograph was hers now, as intended, but she'd folded the ribbon and pressed it into his hand and said nothing. He'd understood. In the months that followed, Things changed in the particular way that real changes happen, not all at once, not cleanly, but incrementally and durably. Vanessa began calling her father on Tuesday evenings, not because she scheduled it, she had initially tried to schedule it, which was the only mode she knew, but because the first Tuesday after the wedding she'd found herself reaching for her phone at 7 o'clock and dialing without deciding to, and it had continued from there. Richard talked about his neighbor Margaret's garden, and a documentary he'd watched about deep-sea creatures, and the fact that his knee had been giving him less trouble since the weather warmed. She talked about her board meetings and the contracts she was pursuing, and the city she was trying to decide whether to move Bradford to or be moved by. He listened, and she could hear him listening, the specific quality of his attention, which had always been total, and was more valuable now that she understood its dimensions. She brought him to Connecticut for Christmas. Not to a separate wing, not managed at a careful distance. To the dining room. Bradford's mother, Patricia, who had 3 decades of experience navigating social complexity, welcomed Richard Carter with the deliberate warmth of a woman who had looked at the man clearly and decided her welcome was not a concession but a correction. She seated him next to the senator, who turned out to share with Richard a particular interest in mid-century American military history, and they talked for 2 hours, and neither of them ran out of things to say. In the spring, Vanessa established the Carter Foundation, named over Richard's mild objections. For the family rather than the founder. Its mandate was the support of single-parent veterans navigating financial and healthcare systems that had not been designed with their specific circumstances in mind. She funded it quietly at first, then publicly, because she decided that visibility was useful when it directed attention towards something true. The foundation partnered with General Webb's Veterans Advocacy Organization. They held their first event in Newark, 3 blocks from where Meridian Analytics had rented its first subleased office, and Richard sat in the front row and applauded with the energy of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to be said aloud. He did not move in with them. He kept his apartment in Trenton, near Margaret and the neighborhood he'd lived in for 20 years. But he visited more. He had a key to Vanessa's apartment in the city. He used it occasionally, arriving unannounced, which she had once forbidden, and now allowed, and she'd come home to find him in her kitchen, having located ingredients she hadn't known she owned, making something that smelled like the dinners he'd cooked when she was 7 years old. She would set her bag down and sit at the kitchen counter without being invited, and watch him move around her kitchen with the calm competence of a man entirely comfortable in the activity he's engaged in. She put his photograph in her office, not the graduation photograph that was on the bookshelf in the bedroom now, where she saw it every morning. In the office, on the wall behind her desk where visitors could see it, she hung a photograph of Richard, in his army uniform, 26 years old. Pre-Eleanor, pre-separation, the specific posture and expression of a man in the fullness of what he'd chosen and was choosing. He'd sent it to her when she asked. He'd written on the back, in his difficult handwriting, "You didn't ask for this. I was younger." She'd framed it anyway. Once, during a meeting with her executive team, 12 people around a long table. All of them high-achieving, all of them accustomed to Vanessa Carter's particular quality of leadership. One of the newer directors, a woman named Andrea Sims, who had joined from a competitor and was still calibrating the room, looked at the photograph behind Vanessa's desk and asked about it. Not impolitely. Genuinely curious. She'd heard versions of the wedding story, which had circulated in a certain professional community the way unusual stories do, gaining texture and losing precision at each step. "Is that your father?" Andrea asked. "Yes," Vanessa said. "He was in the military?" "He was." Vanessa turned to look at the photograph, the young man, the uniform, the expression. "He gave it up to raise me. He never told me, until I found out by accident. He worked night shifts for years. He sold his father's watch to pay for my housing deposit. He applied for a veteran scholarship on my behalf and asked the program to keep it quiet so I'd think I'd won it myself." She turned back to the meeting. "He didn't want me to feel like the success wasn't mine." The table was quiet. "Every number on this board," Vanessa said, with the particular flatness of someone stating a fact they've processed completely, "started with him." She picked up her pen. "Now, where were we?" "On a Thursday evening in late autumn. Richard Carter arrived at Vanessa's apartment with a casserole and a library book about the deep-sea creatures he'd mentioned wanting to read more about. He had his key. He let himself in. The apartment was empty. She was running late, which she texted him from the car. He set the casserole in the oven at low heat and sat down at the kitchen counter with the library book and read for 40 minutes. When Vanessa came home, she found him there. And she dropped her bag and sat beside him, not at the counter but close enough that their shoulders touched. And she said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and he continued reading, occasionally telling her something interesting about the creatures in the deeper water that no light reaches. And she listened, and outside the city made its sounds. And the apartment was warm, she thought, not for the first time but with a clarity that had not diminished. This was where the success had always been, not in the numbers on the board or the names on the donor lists or the handshake from Douglas Ellison or the article in Forbes. Here, at this counter, with this man who had sold his watch and worked the night shift and made sure the ground held and never once, not once, asked her to thank him for it. He had asked only for his daughter. He had her now, fully and without condition, the way he had always had her, even when she had not known how to have him back. The casserole was ready. She got up and took it out of the oven, and her father set his book face down on the counter to hold his page, and they sat together at the table in the kitchen of the apartment she had built her success large enough to afford, and they ate dinner. No distance between them, no weight of what hadn't been said, only this: a father and his daughter at a table. The simple gravity of belonging to each other. The long overdue arrival at the place they should have been all along. The greatest gift I ever had didn't come with a certificate or a title. It came home from work every night with tired hands and made sure I had everything I needed to become someone who forgot, for a while, where she came from. I remember now. I won't forget again. Vanessa Carter. Carter Foundation Inaugural Address. Spring 2026.